All right, my English teacher friends. So in this writing workshop, we're going to do something pretty interesting, pretty unique. So what we're going to do is kind of a status quo poetry analysis writing workshop whereby we feature a fantastic poem, Mountain Dew Commercial Disguised as a Love Poem by Ozmann. And what I'm doing with my students is some hardcore poetry analysis, and we have thematic grouping. So, per thematic group, we have 10 poems. So, I did groups on roadkill, love, parent child relationships, sports, war, coming of age, etc. And to demonstrate how to write the actual essay, I've selected some poems that are off limits. So, what I mean by that is, since I wrote my essays about these particular poems, students cannot choose these poems. That way, I really cut down on the mimicry and, well, the general stealing of my writing and, students calling it their own. So, I'm going to demonstrate a concept where I draw upon children's literature to indicate and to show for my students how to sustain a clear, cogent line of reasoning. So I'll go through it very methodically, very slowly, and show you how to cobble this essay together, but also really explicitly talk about how many children's stories have the line of reasoning that we want in essays. And I'll focus a lot on my template of the syllogistic method, which is the template that my students use and I use to stay cogent, stay logical, stay very methodic and deliberate within the body paragraphs, but it all gets anchored in the thesis, obviously. So what I'm going to do is reference this book called Extra Yarn. It's written by Mac Barnett, illustrated by John Klassen. And in the story, I'll give you a quick synopsis of the story. In the story, you have Annabelle, who's right here. And she comes upon this black box, and it's full of magical colors of yarn. And she just has extra yarn, extra yarn, extra yarn. So she just knits and knits and knits and knits for everybody in town, all of her schoolmates. And she even has so much yarn that she knits it for the inanimate objects in the story, like the truck here. And as you can see here, she knit for all of her friends, right, at her schoolhouse and in her neighborhood. And when I instruct line of reasoning, I often talk about yarns. And I do something that literally is a yarn test. So I'll put students' essays up on my overhead. And with yarn, I have a little yarn basket in my room. I'll cut out like a piece of red yarn and a blue yarn and delineate for students how their line of reasoning should stay intact as they proceed from intro, from thesis, throughout the body paragraph. And I'll indicate how to do that in just a second. So the big thing in order for this to happen is you got to Bob Ross your instruction. And here's what I mean by that. Imagine if Bob Ross were to come on to, the joy of painting and say, "Hello, happy little people. Today we're going to paint a beautiful New England autumnal landscape with beautiful fall foliage. And in the center of our canvas, we're going to include an old rickety New England wood-covered bridge going over a babbling brook." Like, we would be totally confused and confounded if he said, "Here's a graphic organizer, on your mark, get set, go. You got 2 class periods in which to complete it," right? So what he does is he gets to the easel, he gets to the canvas, and he paints through that assignment with us. And one of the things that I always encourage teachers to do is to paint with your students. So what you're going to see as I go over, my templates for the introductory paragraph and my templates for the body paragraphs, you're going to see my painting. You're going to see me writing with my students. And I prepare these slides before kids come into class. I get asked that question a lot. And I just say, all right, so we're doing literary analysis. We know we have to invert the thesis. Here's example 1, 2, 3. Any questions? On your mark, get set, go. It totally demystifies the writing process when we do that. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is this: how do I write the introductory paragraph? And implicit in the prompt is this. You have two questions. What is the authorial intent and how does the author construct meaning? So for those of you that are familiar with my work, you know that every single time I do a writing workshop that features the expository modes of literary analysis or rhetorical analysis, I have this slide. So implicit in the prompts for FRQ1 and FRQ2 on the AP Literature exam is this question. Are these questions, I should say. What is the authorial intent and how does the author construct meaning? And for FRQ2, which is the rhetorical analysis on AP Lang, if students answer these questions accurately, so if they can ascertain a really good deep read of the poem, of the prose, of the rhetorical passage, they're going to crush their essay if they can wield all of that nuanced stuff and keep it cogent and keep it logical as they proceed throughout their writing. So here's what we're going to do. Talk about two templates, the declarative thesis and the inverted thesis. So again, for those that are familiar with my work, you know that for literary analysis, we always invert. And here's what I mean by that. Let me go back to this slide. We take 3 sentences and answer the question, what is the authorial intent? And the last sentence is going to be the thesis. How does the author construct meaning? And in answering that question, you focus on your literary terms and devices. So it's 3 sentences, authorial intent, 1 sentence, construction of meaning. An introductory paragraph, when you're using my templates, is always going to be 4 sentences long. So let's just get right to the inverted. So as I said, you end with the thesis. Start with that context and background. So you're going to have a heavy thematic focus. Some teachers, instead of asking what is the ethereal intent, will ask what's the universal truth, what's the universal theme. So it doesn't matter how you ask the question, right? It's going to take about 3 sentences to do that. Last sentence, boop, drop in construction of meaning. Focus on those terms and devices. So there's more to it than that, right? You got to go for the nuance, the pizzazz, the flair points. And I have my students focus on tier 2 level vocabulary. So I run a word study academy from day 1 until they leave me. Throughout the academic year. And by tier 2 level vocabulary, I simply mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level word. So you don't want students to totally geek out and sound pretentious and contrived, but it is an academic paper, so they should flex their vocab a little bit. And it's also, I'll show you in my exemplars here, it's also a good idea to teeter-totter balance a little bit of colloquial and vernacular with the tier 2 to keep the voice natural and supple. I think that's really key to getting the sophistication point on the AP exams. Sentence constructs. This idea comes from my Nuance Academy, which I also run throughout my academic year. And in my Nuance Academy, I discuss a really unique concept that comes from Strunk and White in their seminal text called Write It Right. They make the assertion that there's 12 different ways to construct a sentence. So my students have pretty good control, at least, my students that focus and, give me an iota of effort. They have a pretty good idea of how to manipulate their syntax and to wield different sentence constructs for purposes of voice rhythm and flow. So in the samples, in the exemplars, you won't see students going short simple declarative sentence followed by short simple declarative sentence followed by short simple declarative sentence. So we've all read essays that go chop, 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 chop because of the sentence constructs. So my students really know how to avoid that. And as always, it's going to be 4 sentences long. So in referencing the yarn test, ultimately, you're laying down the big yarns, the big strings in your introduction. And I often liken this to the following analogy. And I need to make a writing workshop about this because it's kind of a cool analogy, and it made things click for a number of my students. The introduction, right? The purpose of the introduction is closely akin to this. Imagine a quarterback going up to the line of scrimmage and saying, "Hey, defense, Here's the play that I'm going to run. I'm going to run down 42 blue on 3. And if you don't know what that means, it means I'm going to give the ball back here to number 34, who's standing behind me. He's going to hit your left tackle in the nose and go straight for the end zone. And then the quarterback goes to the center and calls down 42 blue on 3, hands it to 34, and off he goes. Or imagine this analogy, like a poker game where the poker player shows the cards to everybody at the table before laying them down and says, "Hey, I'm going to win this hand," right? So you kind of need that confidence in that swagger when you write. You announce your call, you show your hand in it, and in terms of yarns, you're going to lay down your line of reasoning, the initial seeds of your line of reasoning in the introduction. So check this out. We're going to have 3 sentences answering the question, what is the authorial intent? 1 sentence, how does the author construct meaning? So I tell my students to focus on the most salient, germane, relevant, pertinent terms and devices in the piece. So look at this. For many, there's a very public and dramatic face to love's outward expression, right? So what's Ozmann's main gist here? What's he doing? Why did he write this? What's his exigence, right? So there's a big separation between public love and private love in the piece. It's a grandiose gesture like standing beneath a lavishly built balcony in the crisp air of night, bellowing an original poem of woo and pathos. But everlasting loves know the idiosyncrasies of deep privacies and small gestures. So now we're at the 4th sentence. Hit me with the construction of meaning, right? We got the universal theme. We got the universal truth. We have the authorial intent. Last sentence, how does Ozmann do this? How does he construct that meaning? Ozmann highlights this through a long series of subordinating conjunctions and a very exacting character sketch of the wife. So the syntax and the characterization are the 2 driving forces that yield this, right? All of this stuff that I talked about in the first 3 sentences. So it's always 3 plus 1. Note the vocab. Good words in here: gesture, lavishly, bellowing, pathos, woo, I like, idiosyncrasies, very, very good. And in terms of sentence constructs, it flows. So look at the first sentence, compare that to the second sentence, compare that to the third sentence, compare that to the fourth sentence. So you can see there's no parallelism in the sentences. So students aren't writing poetry. They're not writing, a creative piece. So usually you hold off on your parallelism until you hammer your point down in the syllogistic body paragraph, which we'll get to in just a second. So in the introductions, usually I tell my guys, you don't really probably have a need to be paralleling your sentence constructs. So get them flowing. So out of the gate, if a student were to write this, they're blazing. They're off to great speed. So good sentence constructs, good voice, rhythm, flow. I think they're in contention to get the sophistication point out of the gate. So here's student number 2, going to follow the same 3 plus 1 template. True love comes in intimately embracing a partner's idiosyncrasies with a heart full of acceptance. Moreover, the expression of big love is not through grand public gestures, but in the small private moments shared in quietness. For love to endure and withstand the years, a total and utter embrace of a partner's quirks and tics is a must. All right, so now we're 3 sentences in, and that's everything that Ozmann's doing thematically, right, within the piece. So just what is the authorial intent? What's the universal theme? What's the universal truth? Last sentence, construction of meaning. Ozmann expresses this sentiment through a long series of subordinating conjunctions and through the specific characterization of the wife. And those are like the 2 big terms in the piece. The syntax is huge, and the characterization of the wife is also equally big. So don't do a lit terms dumping ground in that last sentence. Just focus on 2 or 3 of the most salient terms devices. Student number 3, going to follow the exact same template. Love seems to love small expressions of love. Oftentimes, people think that they need to do something very public and dramatic to illustrate the depths of their feelings for another. But this is not the case. The small and private expressions of utter acceptance are what hold the most value and meaning. So we're 3 sentences in, 4th sentence, construction of meaning. Ozmann highlights this idea through the manner in which the wife is characterized in his long enumeration of because phrases. All right, and again, the 2 most salient terms, that characterization and the syntax. All those, like the litany of becauses, the enumerated becauses. So all done the exact same way. 3 plus 1, focus on those sentence constructs. Like I like this sentence right here. The use of the dash here is pretty nice. All right. Everything's supple, everything's flowing. Vocab is up without sounding contrived, without sounding pretentious. Beautifully executed. So we have our ball of yarn here, right? Notice I went 2 colors because we're going to have a couple of strings attached in our line of reasoning. So the next question is this. How do I sustain this? How do I keep it going? How do I write the body paragraphs? And that's the kicker right here. We're going to bust out the syllogistic method. And again, those that are familiar with my work and have scrolled through my YouTube channel or taken my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind or any of my other short courses, hopefully at this stage of the game, you're like, holy crap, Christian is not lying every single time, no matter if the students are doing literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, research, the syllogistic method can be used. So we're doing literary analysis. So let's break down what the sequence, what the chronology is going to be within our body paragraph. So first, let me define real quickly what the syllogistic method is and give you a little brief context and history of it in case you're not familiar. And if you want to do a deeper dive on this, then by all means go into my YouTube channel. So the syllogistic method comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum. And the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they would often hurl out these big, juicy, essential questions, kind of like what we do for synthesis and argument and persuasion. So you might get a question like this: what is justice? Which is the whole basis of the book, Plato's Republic. And these great philosophical thinkers would step to the proverbial mic and they would say, this is what justice is. And every time they gave a definition of justice, they would cloak it or house it in a syllogistic construct. And, Aristotle, much like us composition teachers, was really concerned with line of reasoning. He would say things like, why does Jason always win the debate and Wyeth is kind of meh and Todd just tank bombs it, like Todd just can't hold water in his arguments. And he had it. He said, all of my students have really good ideas. It's just a matter of how they package their argument, how they package their thinking. And the really good orators are doing so with like this mathematical computative precision where they go premise, premise, conclusion. And that's what a syllogism is just going premise, premise, conclusion. So if I were to say in premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. You would say, Christian, that makes total sense. That's a really cogent argument there. Sorry for your dog, right? But it makes total sense. And when our students write, we want them to go bam, bam, bam. Premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. Be mathematic, be computative, be organized, have sequence, have chronology, right? So what does that look like in literary analysis? Well, if we label all the parts of first premise, second premise, conclusion, we're going to get this. The first premise is an argument anchored in literary terms and devices. All right, so what we're going to do is start at the beginning of the poem and proceed through it chronologically. The first premise, as I'll model in just a second, is always 3 sentences long. I'm going to say that again. The first premise is always 3 sentences long. And why do I say that? Students that are taught how to write topic sentences, I think, end up quoting and paraphrasing too early in the body paragraph, and therefore they lose the centrality of their argument, and further end up switching the expository mode from the task of writing literary analysis to performing plot analysis. So to keep the argument central, I say take 3 sentences. Also, and I'll demonstrate this in a second, if you take 3 sentences, you can do something that's called multitasking the first premise, so as not to have to write 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph syntax, right? Because that's too elementary and basic. We don't want our students doing that. So I'll show you that first premise in just a second. Second premise is textual support. We have the poem in front of us, so we're going to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. We're not going to do one far more at the expense of the other. So balance that out, keep it in kilter. And then the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, and I really want to emphasize this. Paragraphs have conclusions. Essays have conclusions, but paragraphs have conclusions too. So the conclusion of the paragraphs are where you have your echoes, your links, and your promise. So you echo and link back to the thesis in the prompt. And I tell my students the first premise is a promise. So you got to connect your line of reasoning, right? You got to keep the promise of the first premise. So let's get back to our story about extra yarn and see how we can connect all of this. So in this slide, you can see here that I have balls of yarn placed on my slide. Each ball of yarn is going to be placed next to the term and the argument that I'm going to promise in the first premise. Again, this is going to take 3 sentences. So I'm going to put a yarn next to my promise. What am I promising you, dear reader? So students often say, they ask good questions. The first question is this: how many sentences should a syllogistic body paragraph be? We're using templates, right? So in your introductory template, you want 4 sentences. How many should a syllogistic body paragraph be? And here's my contention. Those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers that students write, those a paragraph of 4 to 5 sentences just does not have enough pith. It doesn't have enough support. It doesn't have enough analysis in it to really flesh out an argument. So I tell my students to go for 10 sentences, hard cap at 12. So across the expository mode, shoot for 10 sentences. That's plenty of space to have enough, quoting and paraphrasing and argument for the analysis and for the support. The second question students ask is this: where should I begin my analysis? And I say, start right where Ozmann starts. So you'll see my students have clauses like this in their first body paragraph, right from the onset. It cues the reader into knowing that the writer is supremely logical. They have a chronology, they have a sequence, they're orderly, right? So what's the first thing that Ozmann does? And in these 3 sentences, have a couple of terms, like maybe 2 or 3 terms, so as, again, to break that pattern of one paragraph diction, 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax. See how the pieces interlock with each other, right? Because these terms and devices don't exist in isolation, they interconnect. So let's see how we do that here. Right from the onset, Ozmann indicates that he's going to enumerate his logic very painstakingly through his syntactical manipulation. So we just got a few things going on here. We're going to have to talk about the enumeration. That's huge. All those sentences that begin with because. His logic, even though we're doing literary analysis, the logic is kind of his logos or his theme, we would say in literary analysis. In rhetorical analysis, we would call it logos. So we got, the enumeration, the theme, and then the syntax. So I placed a different color of yarn next to each of those. Enumeration, orange. Logic, theme, blue. Syntax, green. So look what happens in the rest of this. What follows the colon is a long list of reasons as to why the marriage will survive. Interesting enough, Each reason is offset by a subordinating conjunction. So I'm setting up the syntactical analysis. Note, there's no quoting going on in these three sentences. You don't paraphrase, you don't regurgitate the story of the poem, none of that stuff. Straight up literary analysis argument. So since I dropped orange or red first, I got to go get a quote or a paraphrase, or maybe both, to indicate the orange. I need quotes and paraphrases for blue, quotes and paraphrases for green. So this keeps kids very organized because oftentimes they don't quote and paraphrase with deliberation, and they don't go in a chronological order. So look at what happens for the orange or the red. Fourth sentence begins the second premise. Go get quotes and paraphrases for that orange, for that red. So immediately, almost playfully ponderous, he suggests that here's what he's got. The reasons why their marriage might work, colon. All right, why do we do that? Because we promised you that we would do that right here with that red yarn. We're getting into the enumeration. We're at the colon. So that quote is really the only quote we can use to keep the promise of the first premise right here that we dropped. It's the only quote, right? So you can either paraphrase some kind of expression around that colon or quote it. So we quote, we analyze. From a syntactical perspective, a policing grammarian would most likely advise any writer not to follow a colon with a long string of subordinating clauses, all beginning with the word because. Well, why did we go here? Because we promised you that that's the logic, and the theme is set up through the syntactical manipulation. So now you got to have some quotes that show that syntactical manipulation and how it ties in with the logos and the theme. Very cool. It's all triggered by the because, all that long enumerated list of becauses. This error, if you will, is fitting in light of the reasons Ozmann delineates. Virtually every detail ascribed to the wife is extraordinarily commonplace, but idiosyncratic, just as the syntax is. Holy cow! Holy goodness. So the syntax and the characterization just kind of talk to each other. They just kind of held hands. That's sophisticated when you can link the terms and devices together to make meaning. So we're not done yet. We still got to go on. So let's bring in that blue yarn. The love between husband and wife will endure because the small private things such as laughing loudly at your own jokes and because she yells at her keys when she loses them is what makes the wife so uniquely worthy of his everlasting love, right? So we're getting into the theme. We're getting into the characterization. Now, in terms of quote transitions, I have a little template for that. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum, so a minimum, not exactly a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote small, it should sound conversational, but you can see here, this student had to do some bracketing, right? So you'll need to teach that. So we quoted, let's analyze. Love typically is expressed in feminine language, but the husband loves that she writes poems about bullets and gravestones and that she can hold a pistol, gut a pig. Now, here's something that this student is doing well. I call it multitasking the second premise. Do you see how this student quoted twice in one sentence? Wholly sophisticated. Like, that's really, really good. So you can see my students are doing a lot to get that sophistication point, right? The vocab is up, sentence constructs are good, right? Quote transitions are silky smooth, line of reasoning intact, right? So we're just connecting the yarns here. That's all we're doing. There's a mundane nature to true love, and one can find it in those who circle the things they think are important and put stars next to the things they think their lover should think is important. Ordinary acts such as merely annotating a text hold space for love. It's in the doing, giving, and being of a couple that denies the self to be consumed in flames. All right, so we got plenty of textual support and analysis. Let's go back here. Did we have quotes and paraphrases for the red, the enumeration? Did we have quotes and paraphrases for the logic, the theme? And did we have quotes and paraphrases to indicate the syntactical manipulation? Yes, we did. Did anything else come in to impede upon this? Nope. So therefore, we have a line of reasoning, but we're not done with our paragraph yet. We have to throw a conclusion on it. We have to link it all back to the thesis, the prompt, and the first premise. So this is just takes 2 sentences, typically 1-2 sentences, and you link it all back. It echoes, it reverberates. Love will endure forever and for always if one can stay off the proverbial shit list as Ozmann does and take pleasure in simple joys like pork recipes and extended favors done out of the pureness of heart. Love will also endure forever if one places their partner first and remembers that even small acts reverberate on a large scale. And that, so you kind of end where you begin. So the thesis is a heavy focus on the universal truth, the universal theme, the authorial intent. So is the conclusion of the body paragraph, right? So that's that. So that's how you keep all those yarns connected. So what I do is I read the story extra yarn so that the students are familiar with it. And as I said earlier, with their essays that they write, I take the body paragraphs and I just put yarns next to their promise and drop it down and make sure that all the quotes, all the paraphrases are germane to the promises of the first premise. So in terms of what's it look like all together, this is what the body paragraph looks like. All sync together, right? 3 sentences, first premise, 4th sentence begins second premise, and go methodically through. So that's what that looks like. And if you want the slides, I can send them to you, but that's a whole paragraph. And it goes a little long just because I'm illustrating for students how to sustain that line of reasoning. This exceeds 12 sentences, I think, by 1 sentence. But it's fine. It's totally good. The line of reasoning stays intact, and there's a lot to cover. So students then ask, what do I do next? I'm done with my first body paragraph. And I tell them, stitch more yarn. There's still a ton of stuff left in that poem that needs to get analyzed for a full analysis of it. So what I do is choose different literary terms devices, 3 sentences first premise, choose new quotes and paraphrases, and stitch more yarn. So it's the same thing. New essay, same yarn test. New paragraph, same yarn test. Every single time that students write, especially literary analysis, they can do that. Just stitch more yarn. So I'm at the end here. I'm out of time. So hopefully you found this to be useful and can use it with your students for a poetry writing workshop. And just as a quick wrap up here, note that my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind is now being hosted, run, and endorsed by the National Writing Project. So if you'd like to do some professional development with me to learn all the tricks and trades of my templates, my alternative grading methods, my Plato's Plato discussion modality, my Word Study Academy, my Nuance Academy. Come join us for 5 weeks. And here's what it looks like. We meet Sunday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, followed by Q&A for 5 weeks. And NWP and I offer this many times throughout the academic year and even during the summer months. So, you can go to my webpage, which is www.teachinghowtowrite.com for more information on that. Or you can email me, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com for more information, or go to www.nwp.org and get information there. So also note that throughout the academic and calendar year, I do these one-off courses with NWP. So I do my alternative grading methods 2-hour intensive, my teaching line of reasoning 2-hour intensive, the Nuance Academy, the Word Study Academy. And here's the kicker. A lot of you guys need professional development hours. NWP has those completion badges. So even though it's a 5-week, 5-hour course, my mastermind, you get a completion badge at 10 hours. I have a self-paced course in there as well, which gives you a 10-hour badge as well. So if you can't free yourself up for 5 weeks, that self-paced course is awesome. And we also have in there AP strategies for success. So if you want to know how to write and tackle all the essays, all the FRQs for the Lang and Lit exams, then check out that AP strategies for success. So if you want the slides, have any questions, need anything, email me, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Check out my webpage, www.teachinghowtowrite.com. So be well for now. Happy teaching, happy writing.